The horse would not move. Seraphina Ashworth stood at the top of the front steps in traveling blue, her gloved hands folded so tightly over each other that the seams bit into her knuckles, and watched 4 grown men fail to reason with an animal that had carried her father without complaint for 11 years. It was not working on the horse. "Sable, you old fool. We're only going to the coast." The horse screamed. Not whinnied. Screamed, a raw tearing sound Seraphina had never once heard from any horse in her life. Beside her, at the carriage window, her Aunt Constance went very still. Constance had arrived from Bath only the week before, a full month earlier than she'd been expected, thinner in the face than Seraphina remembered, and vague, deliberately, carefully vague, about her reasons. She had murmured something once, late, over cold tea neither of them had touched, about a dream, something terrible, she'd said, and then immediately, as though frightened by her own words, "But I can't recall what. Isn't that the strangest thing? I woke with my heart going like a hammer, and by the time I'd lit the candle it was already gone, only the feeling left behind, like a room after someone slammed the door." She had laughed it off within the same breath. The whole family had a habit of laughing off the things that frightened them. Seraphina was coming to understand, watching her aunt's knuckles whiten now on the carriage sill, that the laughter was not evidence the fear had passed. It was only evidence they had all agreed, without ever discussing it, not to look at it directly. "Bad omen," Constance said now, lightly, the words at odds with the colour that had gone entirely out of her face. "Nonsense," the Duke said. "The boy fed him rotten oats, that's all. Isn't that right, Thomas?" Tomas, 15, freckled, chronically honest in the way of boys who have not yet learned that honesty is negotiable, shook his head slowly. He had checked the feed himself not 2 hours before, out of nothing more than habit, and found the oats sweet and clean and entirely unremarkable. He did not say so aloud. He had already learned, young as he was, that there was no version of telling a duke, "I don't know why, Your Grace, he simply won't go," that would be received as anything but insolence. It took 40 minutes and a blindfold, and, in the end, the stable-master's own hand pressed flat and murmuring against the animal's trembling neck for a full 5 minutes, before Sable would so much as breathe evenly, before the horse consented to be led into harness. By then, the whole household had gathered on the front steps to watch, servants and family both, and what had begun, as alarm had curdled, as these things do in grand houses, where nothing is ever permitted to remain unpleasant for long, into entertainment. The Duchess Margaret laughed behind her fan, delighted despite herself. The Duke told the story twice more, before they had even reached the end of the drive, embellishing it further with each telling, until the animal's raw terror had become, by the third telling, a charming little anecdote fit for the party. "You'll never guess what our Sable did this morning. Put on quite a performance. Thought we'd have to leave him behind entirely. The kind of story a man tells at supper to be laughed at kindly, stripped by then of everything that had actually happened." Seraphina did not laugh. She sat in the carriage with her knees pressed together and her hands very still in her lap, and she watched the grey coastline come up slow and colourless on the horizon, mile after mile of hedgerow and stubbled field giving way at last to salt marsh and gull cry, and the first far grey suggestion of open water, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than the horse's scream had, "Something does not want us to go." She did not know yet that she was right. She did not know that in 2 days she would fall in love for the first and only time in her life. In the space of a gangway and a rescued glass of champagne and a single conversation about honesty on a wind-scoured bridge. She did not know that in 2 days and a handful of hours she would watch that love drown in front of her, in water so cold it stopped thought entirely, in darkness so total the stars themselves seemed to have been extinguished along with everything else. She did not know that the last sound she would ever associate with the sea would not be its roar, which she had always found rather beautiful, but its silence afterward, the terrible, total silence of a ship that had been full of music and candlelight and 30 of the finest families in the county, and was, all at once and forever, full of nothing at all. She knew none of that yet. She only knew that the horse had screamed, and that her aunt's hands had gone white on the carriage sill, and that the ship waiting for them at the dock in Fenmouth was called the Aurelian, and that everyone who had ever set eyes on her, the shipwrights who built her, the underwriters who insured her at a rate that made even the Duke's man of business blink, the newspapers that had covered her maiden voyage the year before, with breathless, uncomplicated pride, said the very same thing about her, over and over, the way people say a thing they have decided to believe, rather than a thing they have actually tested. Unsinkable. The Aurelian did not look like something that could fail. She rose out of the harbour at Fenmouth like a cathedral laid on its side, black hull and gold trim catching the low afternoon sun, until the whole vessel seemed to burn faintly at the waterline. 4 masts dressed in furled canvas, though half her true power came from the steam engines Captain Edmund Holloway had installed, at an expense that had, by local account, very nearly ruined him twice over, and made him 3 times over since. Duke Ashworth had chartered her privately for 2 nights, a floating house party for 30 of the finest families in the county, sailing a slow loop along the coast and back, with no purpose beyond pleasure, no cargo, no destination that mattered beyond the return to the very dock they now stood upon. It was the kind of extravagance that made sense only to people who had never once had to make their pleasures make sense to anyone. Seraphina climbed the gangway in blue silk, her mother's pearls cool at her throat, and felt the whole enormous vessel move very slightly beneath her feet as she stepped aboard. A living thing, breathing, patient, waiting. "Careful," said a voice below her on the gangway. "She does that. Takes some getting used to." She turned. A young man stood 2 steps down, sun-browned in a way no gentleman of her acquaintance had ever troubled to become, dressed not in the finery of the gathering guests, but in a captain's coat, too fine for a common sailor, and too plain for the party gathering above. The coat, she would learn, of a second mate who had earned his braid honestly and wore it without ceremony. He had his father's steadiness through the shoulders, and none of his father's love of an audience. "You say that as though the ship might have opinions," she said. "She does. Mostly opinions about wind, and occasionally about the competence of whoever's holding her wheel." A flicker at the corner of his mouth. No offence intended to any lords aboard who might presently be holding it. "None taken. I'm not a lord." "No," he agreed, and something in his face shifted. Not quite recognition yet, only a frank, unhurried attention she was not accustomed to receiving from strangers, most of whom looked at her and saw, first and immediately, her father's title. "You're not. Lady Seraphina Ashworth." She watched him carefully as she said it, curious, despite herself, whether the name would change anything in his face. It did. Something crossed it. A small private arithmetic, the recognition of precisely how far above his reach a woman standing 2 steps up a gangway happened to stand. "Ah," he said, "the Duke's daughter. I should bow lower then." "You should not bow at all. It's unbecoming in a man who's just told me the ship has opinions about my father's guests." He laughed, surprised out of him, unguarded, gone as quickly as it came, and something in Seraphina's chest turned over slowly, the particular sensation of a key finding, without warning, a lock it had not known it was searching for. "Julian Holloway," he said. "My father's the captain. For the length of this voyage I'm his second, which in practice means I fetch things, apologize to guests on his behalf when he's short with them, and occasionally rescue champagne from waves that shouldn't exist on a harbour this calm. That sounds like the more difficult post." "It is," he said, entirely seriously, and offered her his hand up the last 2 steps of the gangway, not because propriety required it, since her own maid stood ready behind her for exactly that purpose, but because he had simply wanted, in that first unguarded moment, an excuse to touch her hand. She did not know yet that his laugh would be the thing she remembered longest, longer even than the wreck itself, longer than the cold, longer than the silence after. She only knew, stepping onto the deck of the Aurelian, with her hand still faintly warm where his had briefly held it, that she wanted to hear it again. The party swallowed the evening whole. Lanterns strung the full length of the promenade deck, gold lights swinging gently with the roll of the sea beneath, casting the whole gathering in a warm, moving glow that made every face look softer than it was, every gown richer, every laugh more musical. A string quartet played beneath an awning stitched, at the Duke's particular insistence, with the Ashworth crest in gold thread, visible from the harbour even after dark. He had wanted, he'd said, for Fenmouth to be able to look up and know precisely whose party it was watching. Champagne circulated on silver trays, carried by stewards in white gloves, who had been drilled for a week beforehand on the exact correct depth of bow owed to each rank of guest, and somewhere below decks, a kitchen staff of 20 laboured, sweating, magnificent, over a supper meant to be spoken of at dinner tables for a generation. Seraphina found Julian again near the stern, where the noise of the party thinned to something almost private, almost her own. He was coiling a line of rope with unhurried, practiced competence, the kind of task that required no thought, and therefore left a man's mind entirely free to wander wherever it liked. "Don't you dance? Sailors don't dance on duty, and I'm rather permanently on duty this trip." He set the coiled line down, straightened, and for a moment simply looked at her. Not the sweeping social glance men usually gave her, cataloguing dowry and connections, and the shape of her mouth, all in the same instant, but something slower, something that seemed genuinely to be asking a question, rather than answering one it had already decided upon. "You slipped away rather neatly. Your mother's watching the ballroom door like a hawk." "My mother watches most doors like a hawk. It's a hazard of raising an only daughter with an inheritance attached." She came to stand at the rail beside him. Behind him, the sun was folding itself down into the sea, bruising the whole western sky copper and deep rose, and he stood in front of it as though someone had arranged the composition on purpose, which no one had, which was somehow the whole of what made it beautiful. "What are you thinking about, out here alone?" He considered the question longer than she expected any man to consider a question asked so lightly. "That I'll captain a ship like this myself, someday, if I earn it. That my father spent 30 years working toward the coat he's wearing tonight, and I'll likely spend 30 more trying to fill it half as well. That it's a strange thing, loving something this much, the sea, I mean, and knowing full well it will never once love you back. It only tolerates you, at best, on the days it's feeling generous." He glanced sideways at her. "And that I should probably stop talking now, because you asked what I was thinking, and I've just delivered you an entire small philosophy lecture, unrequested. I asked what you were thinking. You answered honestly. That isn't a lecture. That's simply rarer than you'd think." She let herself smile, more than she'd intended to. "Most men only ever tell me what they believe I want to hear. My whole life it's been, 'You look lovely tonight, and your father's estate must be very fine,' and never once anything a man actually thought, unprompted, standing at a rail with no one listening." "I don't know what you want to hear," Julian said. "I only know what's true. Seems the safer policy in the long run. Costs less to remember, if nothing else." Below them, faint through the deck boards, the quartet began something slow and unbearably lovely, a piece Seraphina half recognized and could not name. She thought, watching the last color drain out of the sky above the wake, that she would remember this exact hour for the rest of whatever life she was given, though she could not yet have said how short or how long, that life's memory of him would have to prove itself capable of holding. Supper that first night was held in the grand saloon proper, beneath a ceiling painted with a fresco of Neptune, and his court, that the Duke never tired of pointing out to guests who had already seen it twice. The Duke's elite circle, the men he called, without irony, his particular friends, though half of them owed him money, and the other half owed him favors he collected slowly and precisely, like a man laying stones, sat arranged around him at the head table in an order that had been quietly negotiated for a fortnight beforehand by wives too proud to admit they cared. Lord Ashcombe, whose son Seraphina was to marry, held court on the Duke's right, a heavy, comfortable man who spoke of his shipping interests with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to load a crate himself. Beside him, Sir Reginald Fairfax, whose fortune had been made and nearly lost twice over in railway speculation, laughed too loudly at every joke the Duke made, the particular laugh of a man keeping a patron's good favour. Lady Ashcombe watched Seraphina throughout the meal with the frank, assessing warmth of a woman already mentally arranging furniture in a house that was not yet hers to arrange. "A fine vessel, this," Lord Ashcombe said, over the fish course, addressing Captain Holloway, who had been seated, with careful ceremony, at the foot of the table. Host's honour extended to the man who had built the evening possible, though everyone present understood the honour came with an unspoken expectation of gratitude. "Unsinkable, they tell me. Is that truly so, Captain? Or is that simply what men say to sell tickets?" "She's as sound a ship as has ever been built, my lord," Captain Holloway said, with the particular pride of a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to say so. "Double hull along her forward third, watertight compartments the length of her. I'd stake my life on her." "And will you?" Sir Reginald asked, delighted with his own wit, raising his glass. "2 full days at sea, Captain. You're staking rather more than your own life on her tonight. You're staking the whole cream of the county." The table laughed, easily, the comfortable laugh of people who have never once had reason to doubt that the sea would do anything but what it was told. Seraphina, seated between her mother and Lady Ashcombe, found her attention drifting, again and again, to the far end of the table, where Julian stood near the service door in his second mate's coat, not seated. Junior officers did not sit at a duke's table, whatever debt of gratitude the duke felt he owed, but near enough to catch, twice, a look she was careful not to let anyone else at the table notice her returning. "You've hardly touched your fish, dear," her mother murmured. "I'm not very hungry tonight," Seraphina said, which was true, though not for any reason she meant to explain. Lord Ashcombe's son, her intended, a pleasant enough young man named Frederick, fair-haired and earnest and entirely unremarkable in every way that mattered to her, leaned across the table to ask whether she'd enjoyed the tour of the engine room that afternoon, and she answered him kindly and truthfully, and thought of someone else's voice entirely while she did it. It happened just after midnight, in the loud golden chaos of the party's first great crescendo, that Seraphina found herself in genuine, unglamorous danger, and Julian, without pausing long enough to know yet what she would come to mean to him, saved her simply because it was the plain, decent thing to do, and decency, in him, required no calculation at all. Lord Pemberton's son, red-faced, unsteady, 3 glasses past sensible, had climbed the outer rail on a dare from a cluster of equally drunk young men, laughing, showing off, one boot already up on the polished brass when Seraphina passed behind him with a tray of champagne flutes meant for her aunt. He lost his footing at the precise wrong moment, fell backward, into her. The tray shattered against the deck in a bright, violent crash that briefly stopped the music, and for one long, silent second, Seraphina was over the rail herself, the black water rushing up cold and enormous beneath her, her hand grasping only air, her whole body already understanding, with a kind of animal certainty faster than thought, exactly what falling into that water at that speed from that height would mean. Then a hand closed hard around her wrist, not air, a hand. Julian hauled her back over the rail in a single motion that cost him a torn sleeve and, she would only learn much later, a badly wrenched shoulder he never once mentioned to anyone, not even his father, not even at the very end. He did not make a show of it. He did not demand thanks in front of the crowd already gathering, gasping, phones of the era being cameras of pearl-buttoned eyes and open mouths instead. He simply set her upright on her own feet, checked with 2 fingers lightly beneath her chin that her eyes were clear and focused, and said, quietly enough that only she could hear it over the general commotion, "There you are, steady now." Her heart was still slamming from the fall that had not, in the end, happened. "You didn't have to." "I did, actually," lightly said. But his hand had not yet released her wrist, and when he noticed this, he let go slowly, as though it cost him something real to do it. Wouldn't have been much of a second mate if I'd let the Duke's own daughter go over the side on my watch. Is that the only reason? He looked at her a long moment, long enough that the crowd around them began, one by one, to notice the looking, and something in his careful composure slipped, just slightly, just enough for her to see underneath it. No, he said, that's not the only reason. Lord Pemberton's son, sobered instantly and completely by horror, stammered apologies no one troubled to listen to. The Duke arrived moments later, white to the lips, and gripped Julian's hand so hard the young man winced, thanking him with the particular fervor of a father who has spent one entire second imagining a world with no daughter in it and cannot yet fully stop imagining it. Anything, the Duke said. Anything at all you need, son. You have only to name it. Only that your grace enjoy the rest of the evening, Julian said. That's thanks enough. He did not look at Seraphina again for the rest of that night, or made himself appear not to. But she caught him once, near 2 in the morning, watching her from across the deck, while she danced dutifully with a young man whose name she would fail to recall by breakfast. And the way he watched her was not the frank professional attention of a man who has simply performed a service and moved on. It was the look of a man watching something he has already, without meaning to, without permission from his own sense, decided he cannot fully live without. What Seraphina did not know, would not learn until it no longer mattered, until knowing it could only add weight to grief already unbearable, was that Julian had a girl waiting for him below decks that whole first evening, in the modest family berth reserved for the captain's household aboard. Cecilia Vane, 20 years old, pretty in a sharp, watchful way, and privately miserable in a manner she had trained herself, over the course of a full year, never to show at parties. Julian had never asked for the arrangement. Captain Holloway had brokered it a year before with a shipping merchant's daughter he considered, correctly, in the strict language of business, a fine strategic union, tying the Holloway name to the Vane family's contracts along 3 separate trade routes. Julian had accepted it the way a man accepts weather, because objecting seemed to cost more than it was worth, because his father's approval had mattered to him his entire life more than his own quiet preference, and because he had genuinely believed, for the better part of a year, that this was simply what growing into a sensible man required of him. Cecilia had watched the whole rescue from the shadow of the stairwell, her arms crossed tight over her stomacher, her mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. She had watched Julian's hand linger on Lady Seraphina Ashworth's wrist a full half-second longer than the rescue itself required. She had watched him not look away, after, the way a man looks away from a stranger he has helped. She said nothing that night, but grief, when it finally comes for the person who saw it coming first, rarely announces itself with speech. It simply waits, patient as water finding a seam in a hull. For the moment, it will be believed. The next morning, the last full day the Aurelian would ever know, Julian found Seraphina at the bow before most of the party had woken, wrapped against the wind in a borrowed shawl, watching gulls wheel and dive over water gone the color of hammered pewter. Couldn't sleep? I never sleep well the first night in a new bed, even a very fine one. She glanced sideways at him. You're not on duty yet, surely. I have the better part of an hour before I am. My father likes his sleep late, when the parties kept him half the night, flattering lords he'll complain about privately over breakfast. He came to stand beside her at the rail, an easy, careful distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and no closer. Come and see something. Properly, this time, not the party version. He led her, with her Aunt Constance's sleepy, half-amused blessing, since propriety required a chaperone even at sea, and Constance had, in her younger years, never once been able to resist a good romance unfolding in front of her, dream or no dream, and found she still could not, whatever weight sat behind her eyes that week, up a narrow companionway to a service platform just below the bridge, technically forbidden to guests, technically exactly the sort of rule Julian had spent his whole boyhood learning precisely how far to bend without ever quite breaking. From there, The whole ship opened beneath them, like a drawing come suddenly to life. The sweep of the deck below, chairs still stacked from the night before, the churn of white water at the stern, where the engines worked steady and patient, the horizon unbroken in every direction. Nothing between the Aurelian and the edge of the visible world, but grey water and greyer sky, and, far off to starboard, a thin dark line on the chart room's most recent survey that the ship's navigator had circled twice in pencil the night before, and mentioned to no one but the log, an unremarked shoal, unnamed, unmarked on any chart older than 18 months, the kind of thing the sea kept quietly to itself until it did not. "I wanted you to see her properly," Julian said. "Not just the lantern version. This is what she actually is." "She's beautiful," Seraphina said, meaning the ship, and meaning something else too. And from the faint tightening at Julian's jaw, she suspected he understood the second meaning perfectly, and had decided, for the moment, not to say so. "I used to come up here as a boy, whenever my father let me sail with him. I'd pretend I was the only person left in the whole world. Just the ship, and the sea, and nothing left to be afraid of." He was quiet a moment, hands loose on the rail. "That's not really true, of course. There's plenty out here worth fearing, if you look for it honestly. Storms you can see coming a day off. Rocks you can't see at all until you're already on them. But up here, for a while, a man can pretend otherwise, and the pretending's worth something, even knowing it's only pretending." "Is that what we're doing? Pretending?" He turned to look at her fully then, and the wind pulled a lock of dark hair loose across his forehead, and he did not push it back. "I don't know what we're doing, Lady Ashworth. I only know I haven't stopped thinking of you since the gangway, and I know that's a foolish thing for a captain's second mate to admit to a duke's only daughter, and I'm telling you regardless, which should tell you something honest about how far gone I already am." Seraphina's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, a small, sharp catch she felt certain he must have heard. "That's a dangerous thing to say to me. I know it is. My father has already chosen who I'll marry, Lord Ashcombe's son. It was settled before I turned 15, before I'd any say in the matter at all, and before I understood well enough what having no say would come to mean. I know that too. Then why say any of it?" Julian was quiet a long moment, watching the horizon, as though it might, if he waited long enough, answer for him. "Because I've spent my whole life being sensible," he said finally, "taking the post my father wanted for me, courting the girl my father arranged for me, and telling myself, most days, that contentment and love were near enough the same thing that the difference wouldn't matter, in the end. Being reasonable about everything, always, because a second mate takes his orders and doesn't ask why, and I'd let that become the whole shape of how I lived, on the water and off it both. And then I looked at you on that gangway 2 days ago, and for one entire minute, I didn't want to be reasonable about a single thing ever again in my life." The wind was cold. Neither of them moved away from it. "I should go back down," Seraphina said, and did not move. "You should," Julian agreed, and did not step back either. Below them, the ship's bell rang the hour, its clean bronze note carrying flat across the water, and below decks, Cecilia Vane woke in an empty berth to a cold, sinking certainty she could not yet find the words to name, though she would find them soon enough, and would wish, for the rest of a long, unhappy year afterward, that she never had. The day unfolded, deliberately and then helplessly, in a long string of stolen minutes. There was the shared look across the breakfast table when Lord Pemberton's chastened son could not meet anyone's eye, and Julian, passing behind Seraphina's chair, with a tray he did not strictly need to be carrying, murmured only, "He'll dine out on that embarrassment for a decade, I should think," low enough that she alone heard it, and had to press her napkin briefly to her mouth to hide the laugh. There was the hour before luncheon, when the Duke, in high good spirits, and generous with his gratitude still, insisted Julian join a small tour of the ship's engine room for the gentlemen present. "The boy saved my daughter's life. The least I can do is let him show off his father's engines." And Seraphina, uninvited, invented a reason to trail along at the rear of the party. ostensibly at her aunt's side, and caught Julian's eye twice across the hot iron dark of the engine room, both times finding him already looking for her. There was the card game after luncheon, in the shade of the aft awning, in which Julian lost 3 hands running, badly, transparently, purely to remain seated across from her, a quarter-hour longer than duty strictly required, until even Lady Constance, sharp-eyed despite whatever weighed on her that week, remarked dryly that the young man appeared to have taken up cards for the express purpose of losing at them. And there was the moment on the shade deck, late afternoon, when Julian passed close behind her chair on some genuine errand and murmured, almost too quiet to catch, that she looked well in green, and was gone again before she could so much as turn her head to answer. Cecilia watched all of it, every stolen minute, every crossed glance, every laugh half hidden behind a napkin. She watched with a face that closed, hour by hour, like a door being shut very slowly by someone determined not to be heard doing it. She cornered him that afternoon in the narrow passage outside the galley, arms crossed, voice pitched low, and already trembling with the effort of keeping it that way. "You haven't looked at me once since we boarded. Cecilia, don't say my name like that, like you're sorry for me. I've always known what this arrangement is, Julian. Your father wanted my father's contracts, and I was the price agreed for them. I never once expected a love match out of it, whatever you may think of me, but I didn't think you'd humiliate me for it. Not in front of half the county, over 2 days, with everyone watching you do it. I haven't meant to. You have. Everyone is watching you watch her. Everyone." Her voice cracked, just slightly, betraying more than she'd intended to let show. "I don't even blame you for it, which is the worst part of the whole thing. I have never once, in an entire year, seen you look at me the way you look at her, without trying to. Not once." She stepped back, gathering the last of her composure around herself, like a cloak drawn tight against weather. "Just don't make a fool of me tonight, in front of everyone. That's all I ask of you. Whatever you're going to do it quietly, and let me keep the little dignity I've managed to hold on to so far." She left him standing alone in the narrow passage, with the whole weight of that settling over him like ballast taking on water. He did not go quietly, not because he meant her cruelty. He carried her words with him the rest of the afternoon, like a stone lodged in his boot, present with every step, but because some things, once truly begun, are no longer entirely within any one person's power to slow. Below decks, unnoticed by all but the ship's second navigator, a quiet, careful man named Abbott, a small correction was made to the day's plotted course. The shoal marked in yesterday's survey, the thin pencil line twice circled, lay very slightly closer to the Aurelian's intended homeward line than the original charts allowed for. Abbott mentioned it to Captain Holloway over the midday meal, briefly, between courses, the way a careful man mentions a small thing he does not wish to seem to be making unnecessary fuss over in front of a duke's assembled guests. "Nothing to trouble ourselves over," the captain said, waving a hand, already 3 sentences into an entirely different conversation with Lord Ashcombe about the price of coal. "Give it a wide berth on the turn tomorrow morning, Abbott. That's all it wants. We've room enough." "Aye, sir," Abbott said, and made a note in the log, and thought no further of it, because there was, that afternoon, genuinely no reason yet to think further of it. A wide berth on a calm sea, taken by a competent hand at a properly attended wheel, was all the shoal would ever have required. It was not the rock, in the end, that doomed the Aurelian. It was the 90 careless seconds in which no hand attended the wheel at all. That evening, the second and final night of the party, the ship's grand saloon, the largest of her private rooms, cleared entirely of furniture and strung with more lanterns even than the deck above had carried the first night, filled with the whole glittering weight of the county's finest families for one last celebration before the Aurelian turned for home in the morning. Seraphina danced with Lord Ashcombe's son, her intended, and found herself unable, 5 minutes later, to recall a single word he had said to her the entire dance. She danced with her father, who held her a shade too tightly and told her, with the particular sentimentality of a man 3 glasses of wine past his usual reserve, that she was growing up too quickly, that soon enough she'd be some other man's charge to look after. And didn't she truly know, how proud he was of her, how he'd give anything at all, to keep her exactly this age forever. She did not dance with Julian. He was on duty, his father's firm instruction, for the first half of the evening, standing watch on the bridge while Captain Holloway enjoyed the party below in the Duke's honour, glad-handing lords and toasting the voyage's success, a full 12 hours before it would prove to be anything but. Near 11, the captain came down to the saloon himself, flushed with brandy and goodwill, clapped his hand on nowhere in particular since his son was not there to receive the gesture, and told the nearest steward to fetch the boy down for a drink. Let him have some fun for once in his life. The watch can mind itself an hour. There's no weather worth speaking of tonight. Julian did not come down for the drink. He stood alone on the bridge in the lantern-lit dark, one hand resting easy on the wheel, feeling the whole enormous patient weight of the ship answer to the smallest turn of his wrist. And when Seraphina appeared at the top of the companionway, some 20 minutes later, having slipped from the saloon on the thin pretext of needing air, he was not surprised to see her. He had been waiting, without quite admitting it to himself, for exactly this. Had been waiting for it, if he was honest, since the moment he'd taken her hand on the gangway 2 days before. "You're not meant to be up here," Julian said, but did not send her away. "You're not meant to want me to stay," Seraphina said, "but I don't think that stopped you wanting it." The bridge stood quiet, the party's noise reduced below to a distant golden murmur, the wheel steady under Julian's hand, the whole black sweep of open ocean unrolling silent and thick with stars in every direction the eye could reach. It was, Seraphina thought, the most peaceful place she had ever stood in her life, and, though she could not yet have said why the thought arrived at all, only that it did, unbidden, and would not quite leave her, the most dangerous. "I have to keep my hand on the wheel," Julian said. "Steady course, until my father comes back up to take her." "Then keep it there." She came to stand beside him, close now, closer than propriety allowed, closer than any sense she'd been raised with permitted. "I only wanted to see it, the way you see her, when no one else is watching you see it. This is exactly how I see her. Steady and quiet and honest. No performance in it at all. That's the only way I've ever known how to be anyone, up here." "Is that why you brought me up before? Because it's the one place you know how to be honest?" "Yes," he said, and it cost him something visible to say it plainly. "I've been honest with you since the gangway, Seraphina, and it's the first time in a full year I've felt entirely like myself doing it, and I don't know what to do with that feeling, because in a few hours, this ship turns for Fenmouth, and you'll marry Lord Ashcombe's son the way it was always arranged, and I'll marry Cecilia, because my father shook a merchant's hand on it, and none of what's honest between us tonight will have mattered in the slightest by winter." "It matters now," she said. And then, because 2 days of stolen glances and one whole conversation about honesty had built, unstoppably, to exactly this, because some things, once truly begun, cease to be within anyone's power to slow, however carefully, either of them had been raised to believe otherwise, she reached up and kissed him. He kissed her back with his free hand coming up to cradle her jaw, careful even now, even in the single reckless act of his whole careful life. And for the full length of that kiss, neither of them thought once about the wheel beneath his other hand, or the course, or the low dark shoal that lay, unmarked on any chart older than 18 months, waiting patiently beneath calm black water, not 400 yards off the Aurelian's current heading. Cecilia found them like that. She had come up herself, meaning, she would tell herself later, though it was already far too late by then for meaning to matter much, to apologize for the harshness of the afternoon, to try once more, one last time, for whatever scraps of the arrangement might still be salvaged between two people who had never chosen each other in the first place. What she found instead undid the last of her composure entirely and all at once. "You said quietly," she said, and her voice was not loud. At first, it was worse than loud, flat and cold, and entirely without hope of anything left to be salvaged. "You said whatever you did, do it quietly, and I find you like this, in plain view of God and the whole ship." "Cecilia," Julian broke from Seraphina at once, stricken, one hand already reaching back for the wheel, and the other reaching for Cecilia, torn between two women and one enormous vessel, and finding himself, for the first time in his careful life, with no sensible answer left to give at all. "Don't touch me." Cecilia rounded on Seraphina instead, an entire year of swallowed humiliation breaking loose all at once, unstoppable now that it had finally found its moment. "You have everything. A duke for a father, a fortune, a fine match already arranged for you whether you wanted it or not, and you couldn't leave the one thing that was mine." "I didn't know," Seraphina started, and it was entirely true, and it did not matter in the least, because grief does not concern itself with the truth of what a person knew. Cecilia shoved her, not hard, but hard enough, 2 years of pride finally collapsing into one graceless motion, and Seraphina shoved back on pure instinct, and within seconds, the two of them were locked together in something too undignified to be called a proper fight, and too furious to be called anything gentler, fists and torn silk, and loosened hairpins, two very different unhappinesses finally finding somewhere at last to go. Julian let go of the wheel. He did not decide to. He would spend whatever remained to him of his life, unable to say precisely when his hand left it. Only that one moment he had been steering the Aurelian on her steady homeward course, and the next, his arms were full of two struggling, furious women, hauling them apart with a strength born entirely of panic, shouting words neither he nor either of them would later be able to fully recall. He did not feel the ship's hull find the shoal, not truly, only a faint shudder, easily lost beneath the shouting, the kind of shiver a great ship gives 1,000 times in a voyage, for 1,000 entirely harmless reasons. A swell, a current, nothing worth turning from the crisis directly in front of him to investigate. He would carry the not noticing with him for whatever remained of his life, however long or short that life turned out, in the end, to be. It was not long. By the time he had the two of them separated, Cecilia weeping now, furious angry tears, Seraphina's hair torn entirely loose, and her lip bleeding faintly where a pin had caught it in the struggle, the wheel stood untended, a full 90 seconds, perhaps longer, and 200 feet below the waterline, a long dark seam had opened quietly along the Aurelian's hull, and the sea had already begun, patient and utterly unhurried, exactly as it always does, to let itself in. It was nearly 2 full hours before anyone above decks understood what had actually happened. The Aurelian was a large ship, and large ships do not announce their deaths quickly or all at once. The first sign was small, a faint list to port that the dancers below, 3 glasses of champagne deep into the evening, mistook for nothing more than their own pleasant unsteadiness on their feet. Then the engines, which had hummed beneath the whole party for 2 days, like a heartbeat no one had troubled to notice until it changed, shifted pitch, labored, and at last failed entirely. The sudden silence where their steady thrum had been more alarming, somehow, than any noise could have been. Then Captain Holloway came down into the saloon himself, his face gone the color of old parchment, and asked, quietly, deliberately, so as not to cause alarm, though alarm came regardless, spreading through the gathered families like cold water finding its way through fine cloth, for every family present to make their way calmly to the boat deck. Julian found Seraphina in the crush on the stairs, both of them already soaked to the knee, from water rising through the lower decks, faster than anyone aboard had believed physically possible, only minutes before. "I have to help with the boats," he said, gripping her hands hard enough to leave marks she would carry, faint, for a week afterward. The last mark of him she would have on her body, though she did not know that yet, standing there in the crush and the noise and the rising water. My father needs every hand he has, and I have to go to him. Seraphina, I have to go. Then go. She would not let him see her weep, not yet, not while there was still something in the world left to be done. Go, Julian. Save who you can save. I never told you the whole truth of it, he said, fast, desperate, the ship listing harder beneath them with every passing minute, the deck itself no longer entirely trustworthy underfoot. Cecilia, the arrangement. I never once wanted it. I told my father 100 times over the last year that I didn't want it, and he never once truly listened, and I let it stand anyway, because standing it was easier than fighting him for something I couldn't yet name. And I am so sorry. I should have ended it honestly months ago, cleanly, instead of letting it end like this, in front of the whole world, with her heart broken and yours put in danger for it. Julian, I love you. He said it plainly, the way he said everything true, without ceremony, without waiting for the correct moment, because there might not be another moment left at all in which to say it. I've known it since the gangway, and I was too careful a man to say so, until the whole world was ending around both of us, and I am done being careful now. I love you, Seraphina Ashworth, and whatever happens tonight, whatever the sea decides to do with either of us before morning, I need you to know that plainly, before I go. I love you too, she said, and the words felt at once enormous and entirely too small a vessel for what she meant by them. Now go, and don't you dare not come back for me, Julian Holloway, don't you dare. The next hour dissolved into a chaos no one aboard the Aurelian would ever fully manage to describe afterward, because there was, in the end, no single soul left alive who had witnessed the whole of it. Julian worked the boat deck alongside his father, the two of them lowering families 2 and 3 at a time into lifeboats never designed to bear the full weight of a private party's worth of guests, canvas ropes burning through gloved hands, the captain's voice, steady even now, even with his own ship dying beneath his boots, the only thing holding the panic on that deck to something short of total. Julian found the Duke and Duchess Ashworth first and put them, over the Duke's furious protests, "Not without my daughter, not without her, where is she?" into a boat alongside Lady Constance, who had gone entirely white and silent, and would not, could not, let go of her sister's hand. The dream she had never quite been able to remember suddenly, terribly, remembering itself all around her in the dark and the noise and the tilting deck. He found Cecilia next, weeping, frozen with fear at the rail, unable to make herself move toward the last boats, though her own maid tugged desperately at her sleeve. He did not hesitate. Whatever grievance had passed between them that day meant nothing at all now, weighed nothing against the simple fact of her life, lifting her bodily into the next boat over her weak protests, holding her hand a moment through the lowering rail, as the boat began its slow descent toward the black water. "I'm sorry," he told her, and meant every part of it entirely, the arrangement itself, the year of quiet unhappiness he had allowed to stand, because ending it honestly had seemed, at the time, so much harder than simply enduring it, the humiliation of that night on the bridge, which he had caused, however unintentionally. "You deserved a man who chose you honestly, Cecilia, from the very start, and I was never that man for you, and I'm sorrier for that than I know how to say properly, here, now, with so little time left to say it in." She did not answer him, but she did not let go of his hand, either, not until the boat had lowered too far for her fingers to reach his any longer, and something in her face, in that last moment before the dark took him from her sight, was no longer only anger. Then, with the ship listing so hard now that grown men had to brace themselves bodily against the rail, simply to remain upright, Julian found Seraphina. There was one boat left on that side of the ship, one boat, and considerably more desperate people gathered around it than it could ever hold. "Get in," Julian said. "Not without you. Seraphina, I am not leaving this ship without you, Julian Holloway, so you had better climb in beside me, because I promise you, I am not moving from this spot." He looked at her, soaked through, bleeding faintly still at the lip, her hair torn entirely loose now, and whipping in the wind that had picked up as the ship's angle steepened, more beautiful to him in that ruined, desperate moment than she had ever been under lantern light in silk 2 nights before, and he understood, with a clarity more total than he had ever felt about anything in his careful, reasonable life, that he had exactly one choice remaining to him, and that it was the only choice in his whole life that had ever, truly, mattered. "There isn't room enough for both of us," he said, gently, as though gentleness could soften what he was about to ask of her. "Look at her, there simply isn't room. I can swim. I know these waters better than any man aboard save my father. I've a real chance, if I go over the side once she's safely away and clear of the suction. You don't have that chance, not in skirts, not in this cold. Please, Seraphina, please let this be the one single thing I ask of you in the whole of the time we've had. I won't survive knowing I left you here. You will." He kissed her once more, hard, final, both hands cradling her face, exactly as he had on the bridge a lifetime, 2 hours, ago. "You will survive it, because you have to. Because somebody has to live to remember what truly happened here tonight, honestly, and I trust you to carry that more than I have ever trusted anyone alive to carry anything. Now get in the boat, Seraphina, please." She got in the boat. He held the lowering line steady, arms shaking with effort and cold, and the whole unbearable weight of what he was doing, and the very last thing Seraphina saw of him, before the dark and the crowd and her own tears finally took him from her sight entirely, was his hand raised above the rail, not waving, simply raised, palm open toward her, as though he might, by will alone, hold the shape of her a moment longer in the empty air than the world was otherwise willing to allow him. The Aurelian went down 11 minutes later. It went down faster than any ship of her size had any earthly right to. The gash torn open by the shoal had split her lower decks to the sea in a dozen places at once, compartments filling and dragging the next below the waterline in a chain no design, however proudly unsinkable the newspapers had called her, could hold back once truly begun. What should by every calculation have taken hours, took, in the terrible arithmetic of that night, closer to 2, and in the final minutes it took almost nothing at all. The great ship simply tilted, further and further past any angle that still looked survivable, and slid, and was gone, taking the last of her 100 lanterns down into the black water, with a long groaning sigh that Seraphina would hear, unbidden, in the quiet moments before sleep for the whole rest of her life. Not a roar, not violence, but something closer to grief, as though the Aurelian herself understood precisely what was happening to her in that final minute, and mourned it on her own account, before anyone left afloat had fully begun to mourn her. Then silence. The kind of silence that has actual weight to it, the kind that presses against the ears the way water itself presses, heavy and total and entirely without mercy. The scattered lifeboats sat low on black water, beneath a sky gone thick, suddenly, with more stars than any soul aboard had ever troubled themselves to notice before that night. Stars that seemed, in that moment, obscene in their indifferent beauty, and no one in any boat spoke, because there was, in that first terrible hour, genuinely nothing yet that could be said that would not sound, even to the speaker's own ears, like an insult to what had just occurred. They were adrift in the middle of a vast dark ocean, hours by any reckoning from a proper shipping lane, with no more than a dozen half-loaded boats between the whole surviving party and the entire cold weight of the sea below them. In one boat, Lady Ashcombe held her son Frederick's hand and said nothing at all, her earlier easy talk of shipping interests and furniture arrangements gone entirely out of her, replaced by the single fixed thought that would not release her for the rest of that night, that she had watched, over supper, a young woman's attention drift again and again toward the foot of the table, and had thought nothing of it at the time, beyond a mother's mild private amusement, and would now never have the chance to ask Seraphina, gently, kindly, whether the boy at the wheel had meant something more to her than a rescued glass of champagne. In another, Sir Reginald Fairfax, who had toasted the captain's confidence not 6 hours before, sat wrapped in another man's coat and did not speak of railways, or of luck, or of anything at all, staring instead at the black water with the particular silence of a man recalculating, in real time, everything he had ever believed himself entitled to. In the Duke's own boat, Duchess Margaret had stopped weeping somewhere in the second hour, not because the grief had passed, but because the body, she was discovering, could only sustain so much of it before it simply went quiet, exhausted, waiting for morning to tell it whether there was any grief left worth resuming. She held Constance's hand in one of hers and Tomas's thin shoulder in the other, and did not let go of either the whole night through. Of the ship's full company, crew and guests and family together, near 300 souls who had boarded 2 days before, dressed for nothing worse than dancing, only a servant boy, young Tomas, who had followed the Ashworth household aboard and had been below decks fetching linens for the Duchess when the fight broke out above on the bridge, could later say with any certainty what had truly happened at the wheel that night. He alone had seen the whole small human sequence of it from the shadow of the service stair. The kiss, Cecilia's arrival, the fight, Julian's 2 hands leaving the wheel for what could not have been longer than 2 minutes total. He alone understood, sitting soaked and shaking in the bottom of a lifeboat with the Duchess's cold hand gripped tight in his own, that no storm and no rock alone had truly doomed the Aurelian that night, that it had been, in the end, an ordinary, human, achingly forgivable moment of distraction, the precise kind every person alive has been guilty of at some point in some smaller, less catastrophic form, that had simply happened, this once, at the single moment in 300 lives, it could not be forgiven by an indifferent sea. He said nothing of any of it that first terrible night. He simply rowed and bailed water with his own cupped hands when the small bailing tin proved too slow, and helped hold a weeping, shaking Duchess upright against the cold, and waited, as they all waited, for whatever dawn might or might not choose to bring them. Dawn found them still afloat. A passing merchant vessel, the Wren's Fortune, bound for Fenmouth herself on entirely ordinary business, spotted the scattered boats a little after 7 that morning, and spent the better part of the day gathering survivors from the water, cold, salt-stung, silent, with a grief too enormous yet to have found any proper voice for itself. Julian was not among them. Neither was Captain Holloway, who had gone down still shouting orders from a bridge he had refused, to the very last, to abandon, nor Lord Pemberton's son, entirely sober now and forever, nor a dozen others whose names would fill the columns of the county paper for a full fortnight afterward, each obituary more careful than the last, to describe the Aurelian's sinking as an act of God, an uncharted shoal, a tragedy no living hand could have prevented. Cecilia survived. She and Seraphina did not speak once during the long, silent crossing home aboard the Wren's Fortune. There was nothing yet, that first raw week, that could possibly have been said between them. But months later, long after the sharpest edge of the grief had finally scarred over into something merely permanent rather than unbearable, Cecilia wrote Seraphina a short, careful letter, the first line of which read, "He was kinder to me, at the very end, than I had any right left to expect of him, and I think you should know that, whatever else you may believe of that night, or of me." Seraphina kept the letter, folded small, in the same drawer as her mother's second-best pearls, for the whole rest of her life. Tomas told the family, eventually, the whole truth of what he had witnessed at the wheel that night, not to condemn Julian, whom he had liked, in the brief way a boy likes a young man who never once spoke down to him, but because Seraphina, in the raw new honesty of fresh grief, had asked him directly, needing at last to know the plain shape of the thing, rather than the comfortable rumour already spreading warmly through Fenmouth's drawing rooms, that the Aurelian had simply struck an uncharted reef in the night, full stop, no living soul's doing, an act of God and nothing more, exactly the kind of story a grieving county finds it easiest to carry forward. She chose, in the end, deliberately, to let the comfortable version stand. It cost Julian nothing now, to be quietly blamed by no one at all, and it would have cost Cecilia everything, to be forever known as the girl two people had fought over on the night 300 souls were lost. Some truths, Seraphina decided, alone in her room with Tomas's account still fresh and terrible in her ears, were hers to carry privately, and no one else's burden to be handed. She never married Lord Ashcombe's son. The engagement dissolved quietly within the year that followed. Grief, everyone politely assumed, and left it entirely at that, though only Seraphina ever knew the true whole shape of what she was actually grieving. And it was not simply the loss of a match that had never once, in all her life, made her heart turn over the way one open hand raised above a lowering boat had managed to do, in a single silent second, on a night she would spend the rest of her life trying and failing not to relive. She kept, for the whole of that long remaining life, a small length of salvaged lantern cord, torn loose from her own hem the terrible morning after, and never once discarded, tucked into the corner of an otherwise entirely unremarkable jewelry box. She never told a single living soul what it was, or why she kept it, or what it had truly cost her to love someone completely for the space of 2 short days, and then to grieve them, quietly, faithfully, for every one of the many decades that followed. Tomas, for his part, grew into a steady, careful man, a shipwright eventually, apprenticed young and gifted early, building vessels with a fastidiousness his old masters found almost superstitious in a boy his age. He insisted always, on every ship that ever passed through his hands, that whoever stood at her wheel should stand there and nowhere else, attend to nothing else, whatever else might be unfolding on deck around them at the time, because he had seen, once, exactly and precisely what could happen when a good man's whole attention went, for the length of 90 careless seconds, somewhere his heart had already gone before him. He never called it a lesson about diligence, or duty, or work. It was never, in his own mind, truly about work at all. It was only ever, to him, about how easily one small, ordinary human moment, a kiss, a fight, 2 hands lifted from a wheel for the space of 90 careless seconds on an otherwise calm and unremarkable sea, can come, without any warning at all, to hold the whole entire weight of everyone a person has ever loved, and how rarely any of us manage to understand that plain and terrible truth until the moment itself has already passed beyond recall, and the water has already begun, quietly, patiently, exactly as it always eventually does, to come in. Many years later, long after Constance had passed quietly in her sleep at Bath, long after the Duke's laugh had gone soft and slow with age, long after Fenmouth's newspapers had stopped printing anniversary pieces about the Aurelian, and the county had found other tragedies to mourn, Seraphina, herself grey now, and unmarried still, walked down to the harbour at Fenmouth on a clear autumn evening, and stood a long while at the very end of the stone breakwater, watching the tide come in. A young woman passed her on the path, arm in arm with a young man, who could not stop looking at her, the two of them laughing at something private, entirely unaware of the old woman standing so still at the water's edge. Seraphina watched them go with something that was not quite envy and not quite grief, but held a little of both, the way the sea itself held both calm and danger in the same unbroken water, indistinguishable to the eye, until the moment one or the other chose to show itself. She thought, as she often did on evenings like this one, of an open hand raised above a lowering boat, palm turned toward her in the dark. She thought of the exact color the sky had held the first evening she'd watched him coil a rope at the stern, unhurried, thinking of things he'd been honest enough to tell her when she asked. She thought, as she always eventually did, of the small length of lantern cord still folded in her jewelry box at home, worn soft now with 60 years of handling, and of how strange it was that so brief a thing, 2 days, no more, could still, after so very long, be the single truest measure of her whole life, against which everything after it had been quietly, faithfully weighed. She did not think of it as a tragedy, not any longer, not for many years now. She had come, slowly, to think of it instead, the way Thomas had once described it to her, an old man himself by then, in the last letter he ever wrote her, before his own heart gave out at his workbench, among the half-built hulls he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. That a whole life can be measured out honestly, in far less time than we're taught to expect, my lady, and that 2 true days are worth infinitely more, in the final accounting, than 60 careful ones spent only pretending. She had kept that letter too. The tide reached the 3rd stone of the breakwater, then the 4th, climbing steady and patient as it always had and always would, indifferent to any single grief laid against it, and Seraphina Ashworth stood and watched it come, unafraid, the way she had learned, at terrible cost, so very long ago, that the sea was never truly cruel, only honest, in the end, about exactly what it was, and what it would eventually ask of everyone who ever loved something enough to sail out onto it. The end. If this story found its way into you tonight, stay a little longer. The sea keeps far more secrets than the ones we've told you here. Subscribe, and let the next tide carry you into another forbidden love, another ship, another 2 days that somehow managed to hold an entire lifetime inside them.